Hey everyone, wondering how to get your 3D print to go from this to this? Well, in today's video, I'll show you how. We're going to be showcasing the War Machine helmet with a custom paint job, and it's coming up next. Let's go. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Again, I am Darkwing Dad, and I want to thank you for watching today's video. If you are a subscriber of the channel, thank you so much for tuning back in. If you're not a subscriber of the channel, I want you to go ahead and click that subscribe button because we got a lot more helpful videos just like this one in the future for you. So today we're going to be going over some tips and tricks, setting things up, how to position, how to print, how to finish, sand, paint, things like that. And we're going to be showcasing the War Machine helmet, or as I've dubbed it, the Iron War Patriot, because it is a War Machine helmet with Iron Patriot colors. So that's just kind of a cool name I gave it. We start with something like this, and we finish with something like this. There's obviously a lot of steps. This video is going to kind of be a precursor to a more in-depth video that I have coming out next week of how to really properly sand, finish, and post-processing, getting rid of PLA lines and getting everything nice and smooth. So I'm going to kind of gently touch in on some of my tips on sanding, some of my tips on painting, basically how and what I did to get this helmet looking like this. So we're going from this to this. So we're going to have some tips and tricks here in this video. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the whole object file and how we get it set up in Slice and Cura. So check this out. All right, so starting with the file. So this is, when you download this, this is a OBJ file or an object file, meaning it's one whole complete object. So what you will have to do essentially is click each one of these pieces and export them as an STL. I don't recommend attempting to print this in one solid piece, and I'll show you why. You can kind of see a little bit here, there's just these gaps, okay, and there are gaps everywhere in the helmet. As you move this, you will see that there are gaps, and there's just some areas where if you look at this file, like look at the gap that is in the ear. That's a huge gap, and essentially what ends up happening is you end up filling that gap in. There we go, that's on the inside of the helmet. You can see these gaps, and that's just how it's supposed to be on the helmet. This is actually a color scheme. It's actually supposed to be blue. I just didn't paint it all the way. But all these gaps here, that's just how this helmet is supposed to be. So I'm actually going to work on, basically, I'm going to open this up in Blender and kind of remake certain parts that are actually fused and formed together. Especially the faceplate, because if you try to print this all in one piece, it inevitably fails because these pieces here are never connected. There's a huge gap. I'm trying to zoom in here and see if I can get it better. I can't from that angle, but there's gaps here, there's gaps here, so when you try to print it, the print inevitably fails. Even this back piece here. Now this piece I merged together. I was going to do this blue and red, but when you actually print these separate, it is a nightmare to try to get them together. So I actually merged these two pieces together. I did this whole thing blue, and then I painted this piece here red just by masking it off. So that is one thing with this file that is a little bit tricky with this whole print, is the gaps that are naturally supposed to be there. So I'm actually working on re-rendering this file so you don't have to deal with those gaps. There's even more you can see. Look at that gap right there. It's just huge, and it reflects in the print. And basically what I ended up doing was, luckily the paint and the filler, the putty, all that added a little bit to it, and it made it smaller, but I still had to, inevitably use hot glue to kind of fill in those gaps. But I'm going to work on getting this piece a little bit more snug and a little bit more tight. So that's something that's going to be a project for mine in the future. And what kind of stinks is when you sit back and look at the piece, you get kind of nitpicky, and you might sit there and say, oh man, it doesn't line up right, this and that and blah blah blah. But you can see how this is supposed to lay. Like look at how far the ear is supposed to stick out there. So one thing is, when you're putting this thing together, if you do this piece, don't get discouraged. It's how it's supposed to look. And what I would recommend doing is just simply, using this as a fallback to look and see how it's supposed to go together. How are the pieces supposed to look? These pieces here, especially this jaw piece, it's not supposed to line up flush. It's supposed to stick out. So what I ended up doing is I exported each individual piece, a total of 15 pieces. So all the face, the ears, the side pieces, mohawk, yada yada, and I exported them as their own STL. So here you can see I've got everything here. The lips, the cheeks, the ears, left and right, everything's basically labeled as what they are, okay? So you export these as an STL, and then you're gonna open up your slicer, basically put these pieces on here individually, and I'll show you how and why to do it. So certain pieces like the rear piece obviously are going to go completely flat. So we'll change this to solid, and with this piece, really all you want to do is get these pieces flat and vertical, okay? Again, I printed mine at 125%. If you got a larger dome, you're gonna wanna measure and do it a little bit bigger, but 125 worked for me. So there's gonna be certain pieces that are self-explanatory. The back, the jaw, any of these front pieces here, basically on this. So like all these, you're just gonna have flat. So you would want these laying completely flat. So anything like that, we just want it flat. So just lay completely flat. So the back ones, so the back piece here, very self-explanatory. Do that. Things like I'll just show you the bottom chin. Same idea. We just want to lay this flat. And of course, make sure you're scaling everything at whatever size you need it to be. I highly doubt 100 will work, but pretty much flat. And what's nice about these is most of these, they don't need a ton of supports. This will actually print without a support. However, I would recommend it because I printed mine without it and I got a little squirrely right around in this area. So I would recommend just at least letting it generate supports for this rear piece here, just so it prints a little bit smoother. Having these prints crisp and eccentric is going to be ideal and really what you want to get this whole helmet to kind of fit together. So self-explanatory with the bottom, the rear head, and the jaw pieces. Just kind of do those laying flat. Now, when we get into some of the other pieces, we'll just say an ear piece for the heck of it, okay? Same thing, we want it vertical. So you don't want to lay it flat, okay? A lot of people think it's good to lay it like this, or to flip it around and lay it on this plane where it's completely flat. And this is why I wouldn't recommend it, okay? So if you lay it like this and and it prints, you're gonna get that circular finishing of a print. So you know that circle as it finishes towards the end of the print, and it's going to really affect some of these body lines and some of the eccentricity of the print. So I do not recommend printing it like that. On the flip side, I don't recommend printing it like this because there's really no way that you can get this flat, and it's just going to create a lot of supports, and that could create more sanding for you. You can do it this way. However, I printed all of mine basically just vertical like this and found it was the fastest and most efficient way and really the cleanest way to do it. So I basically printed it like this, and looking back on it, you could print it flat with the face down. I've just noticed that sometimes what happens is the supports end up messing all this up, and then you sand it so much and you lose that line right there. It ends up getting rounded off and you lose a lot of definition. So typically what I do is I'll have them straight up, and they'll print like this with basically no support. You can use brim or raft or whatever you want. I usually don't. I just use some hairspray on my glass bed and print away at a slow speed. And then worst case scenario, if you have a little bit of that kind of like remnants here where it gives that circle pattern, you can just very easily sand it, and you can use you know, like a glazing putty or a body filler if need be. It's really usually not necessary, but it typically it's not too bad, and you can kind of zoom in to see It's usually more of a straight line pattern, so this will sand down very easily, and it did for me. So I like printing a lot of these pieces here just completely vertical and on their side. Another example here is on the Mohawk, which is a larger piece, and you wouldn't want to print it like this because you're going to waste a ton of time, a ton of filament on supports, and you're going to get that circle pattern up here, which is going to create more work for you for sanding. Best way to do this is kind of flop it on its side here, make sure it's laying flat, and it is going to have a little bit of a lift in the front and a minor lift in the back. You just want to try to get it as level as possible. So you'll have a little bit of support here, a little bit of support there. When you're laying pieces on their side or vertical, always make sure you check your overhang. So with this particular piece, the Iron Patriot version 1 that I did not do supports all on this, and what happened is this piece printed very sloppy because there was a huge overhang, and I did supports on the build plate only, not everywhere. So this printed really bad. I had to sand the heck out of it, reinforce it with body filler. It wasted a ton of time. So with certain pieces, look back and say, okay, I've got a big overhang here. Let's go down and change our support to everywhere. And let me find it here. Change it to everywhere, and usually either 60 or 65 degree overhang is what you have. Usually between 8 and 10 density I will run on my supports, and that way when the piece prints you have support right here, and that's really all the support. You know, you've got like I said, a little bit here. Let me see here, get rid of the shell. It supports this whole piece here, so it prints nice and crisp. You got a little bit here, a little bit there, a quick sand, and it's good to go. So with this, I print everything, like I said, on its side, basically to avoid unnecessary supports, wasted time, wasted filament, etc., etc. The last piece that I will show you are some of the, what is it, the brow, and then the, I think it's the top head, I'm not sure what I labeled it. Okay, right side head is what it was. So with these, again, what you want to do is just very simply find the flattest plane to put them on. So some of these are very easy. So like this piece here, you know, it would make way more sense to lay it on this plane versus here. You're going to get a bunch of supports. It's going to print very sloppy. You're going to have to do a bunch of sanding. So again, we would want to mount it, or we would want to place it on the build plate on the flattest plane. So we would very simply just rotate this to where it's primarily flat, something like that, and you can adjust it vertically and whatnot. But just kind of play with them, get them as flat as you possibly can. Again, you've got some overhang here. So on this piece here, because you've got that overhang on that little piece in the face, on these right here, these pieces right here, they can print sloppy if you don't have enough support. So it's very, very important to make sure you're taking that into consideration. And again, you'd probably want to do it with your support placement everywhere to avoid some unnecessary sanding, because this is a very intricate spot and it is a pain in the butt to sand. So for those front pieces here, it's this piece here that we're looking at to get those clean and crisp. You want to, you know, just reinforce it with some supports so it prints a little bit nicer. And that's such a small area, the supports aren't really going to add much doing that. For the most part, this thing is going to print without any sort of support. It's just going to generate a support right there. On these here, I have no idea why I have that in the background, but I'm going to delete it. Same concept for these. You would not want to lay this flat, because it is curved, so it's going to create some sort of support and just make it a nightmare to sand. And we have that round edge that we don't want this completely round. We want that little bit of definition. So if you were to flip this on its side and then sand the heck out of this, you could completely round that off, and then that's going to affect you know, basically how this looks, because on this helmet you've got this minor definition here that rolls right into the headpiece there. So you've got this curve with just a little bit of definition. So if you round that off, you're going to lose it, and it could definitely affect the way that your helmet works. So placement is definitely key, and not just really with this helmet, but with any multi-piece helmet. If you're trying to do helmets on Ender 3s or smaller printers, you have to take that into consideration. Look at the piece and see how it's going to lay. You know, try to avoid doing heavy sanding in areas that show detail, because it can definitely affect the way the piece looks in the end. So again, with this one, you want to lay it as flat as possible. You are going to have supports generated under here. There's no surprise. It's not too bad. So lay that one flat. And then these ones were probably the trickiest ones. These side earpiece or side head pieces, whatever they're called. There's really no way you can lay it completely flat, because if you lay it completely flat here, you're going to create a ton of supports here. What I actually did was kind of did it in the middle, and it actually worked out really well. When I did my first helmet, I laid it completely flat and it looked terrible. There was that circular pattern and it just took forever to sand. So this actually worked pretty good, and this kind of goes against what I said about getting it as flat as possible. But I tried with helmets in the past, printing it this way and printing it all different ways, and it really worked best to actually do it, and these all generate supports. But like I said, if you have your support set up properly, they just snap right off, and it's just a little bit of sanding. But you can try it this way. The one helmet I did, I printed it this way. It wasn't too bad. I found that it just printed a little bit cleaner, because you want this really crisp. This has to line up perfect with that helmet. This has to be flush, because it actually kind of contours in a little bit. So if you sand that too much, again, you could lose that line of definition on the piece. So that's why I went from the bottom, because it's a lot easier to mimic and recreate a straight line or a flat plane versus a curved one. It's very hard to naturally create a completely symmetric curve. So that's why I print mine here. That way, if I need to straighten these out with sanding, you just use a flat edge and you can keep those completely straight and contoured. So that was my my whole ideology behind printing it the other way, printing it like this, because it's easier to recreate a flat plane than a curved one. That is pretty much it for the way you set things up, and obviously you would go through and do that with, you know, every single piece here. Now, one thing I will say, with this particular piece, you can print it in 17 pieces, and I'll show you why. So you can see I did my jaw piece, and it's in one solid piece. However, if you actually go back to this model, it is actually 3 pieces. So this cheek is actually a separate piece. So this is actually a separate piece. So you can see there's a big hole in there. When I do this helmet again, I will actually print this separate, and hear me out, and here's why. When you print this, even with supports on, it's very hard to sand these little edges. And painting it is actually kind of a nightmare too. Try to get a better angle here. But this edge here is very hard to get perfect, okay? If you print this separate, you actually could print it flat, which in this consideration would be better. To print it face down and then have the pattern maybe go on the inside. I haven't tried it, but that's just what I'm thinking. It took me pretty much a whole day, timed-wise, to mask this off and paint it. I had to paint this whole thing red and then wait about 30 hours, tape it off, then paint this silver, and then go through and wet sand and clean up all the tape marks and everything. And then sanding this was just an absolute nightmare. And it's these right here, these ones all, and it, like, trying to get this is so hard. So this would be maybe the only piece that I would say you may want to lay flat, because if you get those lines here or that pattern when it prints, it's easier to sand that because it's flat. Here, trying to get under here, folding sandpaper and getting everything in there, Trying to get in there, folding sandpaper and little crevice tools and everything, it's very, very, very hard to get that piece perfect. And then if you try to load filler or load, you know, paint or anything, you get runs. It is a nightmare to sand in here. So I printed mine like this, but you can actually print this piece, like I said, in 17 pieces. So it would be 15 is the way I printed it, but you can do these jaw pieces separate. So the next time I actually do this particular piece, I will be trying to do this with the cheek pieces separate. As far as my settings go, you know, settings are touchy. People ask, hey, what's your settings? What do you do this? What do you do that? How do you get the print so clean? My general opinion is if you're doing a raw print like a silk print or something, then yes, layer height definitely comes into effect. You'd want to do something around 0.12 or 0.16. However, it doesn't matter, and I've tried printing at 0.12 and 0.32. You still have to sand these, and there's still a large amount of post-processing. You've seen from my video with my suit, I printed the majority of that at 0.32, and I got great results out of it. You know, your wall thickness is very important. The amount of top layers that you have, the thickness of your top and bottom layers, your speed, you know, is killer. People try to whip through these and print them super, super quick, and they wonder why they're sloppy or why they get layer shifting, you know, yada, yada. My settings aren't, I don't print fast. 55 millimeters per second, 35 on the infill, 27.5 on the wall. Outer walls are 40. I don't print fast. I print at 95 to 100% feed rate and just kind of let the machine print it at a slower rate, and they come out really clean, and that's really what I would recommend. I've talked about things like your acceleration and your jerk settings, turning those down a little bit. You can still get really good prints out of a lower layer height printing at a slower speed. So don't think that if you print these at 0.12 that you're not going to have to do any sanding. Can it save you a little bit? Yes, but honestly, when you're trying, there's so much post-processing work that needs to be done. I found that it really doesn't help you that much. The proper positioning of the pieces, your proper print speed, and your settings. Again, fine-tuning your printer. When you get your printer fine-tuned, layer height almost becomes irrelevant to an extent. So that's really what I would recommend. Get your proper retraction settings in, print at a right speed, get the right amount of infill, get the right amount of walls. I see all these people, they're like, oh, I've got these patterns, I've got this, I've got that. You know, is it worth it to save 40 grams of filament? You know, just 20% infill density is great. Do enough walls, you know, do the right amount of shell thickness, things like that, and everything will turn out great. So those are some tips for that. In reference to this particular helmet, it may be different if you're doing a Mando helmet and things like that, but these are just some tips on some of my settings and the way I positioned everything for printing. Those are just some tips for printing this file. And like I said, guys, do not load this build plate up with tons of pieces. When I printed this, I would only do 1 or 2 pieces at a time. You know, the less travel that your printer has to do, the quicker you can get it printed. So I know it might seem silly, like, oh, I'm only going to print 1 or 2 things. Trust me, you'll actually get done a heck of a lot faster. When you reduce travel time and just spend more time just printing, you'll actually get the helmet done a lot faster. So that's my tip and some of my settings for printing this piece. Let me show you guys some tips and tricks on post-processing, sanding, and getting all these pieces smooth. So yeah, as you can see from the video, hopefully a lot of helpful tips there. Kind of helps break down the file. Again, if you are going to tackle this helmet, this is the helmet at 100%. This is at 125%. There is no way in heck this is fitting on your head. This will. I just don't want to get fingerprints on it right now. So, so like I said in the little video there, guys, 125% is what I went with. It fit great. Absolutely, definitely recommend printing it at a bigger size if you are going to actually wear it for a cosplay or just kind of mess around with it, yada, yada. Definitely want to scale that piece different, but no one's head is the same. I kind of got a smaller dome, so you might need something a little bit bigger. Kind of touched on that in the video there, so just make sure you're scaling those parts to the correct size, so hopefully that video helped you. So now that we've covered basically setting up the prints, let's say you have your parts printed, you want to get to sanding, you want to get rid of these ugly, nasty PLA lines. We want to make it start looking something like this. How do we do it? Check this out. So once your pieces are printed, you can start sanding. Now, a lot of this helmet I did use a machine with, so I used a DA sander and 180 grit. But some of the smaller pieces, like the thinner areas, like the jaw and the chin, I did by hand, and I actually started with 120 and 160. I like to do 2 stages of sanding, so if I do 180, I follow up with 220. If I start with 120 or 160, I finish with 180. But I recommend like a 3M or a Gator sandpaper as seen here. Once everything's nice and smooth for the most part, you're still going to have some PLA lines, and that's when your glazing putty comes in. So basically what you want to do is clean the pieces, wipe them down with IPA or water or something to get rid of any dust or anything. And you want to just start applying glazing putty. You want to do it thoroughly but very thin. This isn't like body filler, okay? It's not meant to be put on thick or put on heavy. It's meant simply just to fill in very small imperfections, hairline cracks. It's perfect for PLA lines. It dries super quick. In 10 or 15 minutes, you can sand it down. After you get all your pieces done, they're going to look something like this, and then you can get right into sanding these down. Now, you want to use a different sandpaper. You don't want to use the same grit. You don't want to use 180 again or anything like that. You want to do lighter. So typically, we want to start with something like 220 or 320. Now, the reason you want to change your grit is because you don't want to strip that glazing putty off. If you started and sanded with, say, 160 and then applied glazing putty and went over it again with 160, you're going to strip a majority of the glazing putty off. We want the glazing putty to fill in those imperfections. So you can see here how the glazing putty is doing a great job with filling in all of those PLA lines. So typically when I get to this point, when I put the glazing putty on, I'll start sanding with 220 and 320. And sometimes I'll put a second coat of glazing putty on, and I'll use little tools like this you can see here. I'll do this all by hand. I don't recommend using a machine. Again, you can control the pressure, the speed a lot better by hand, and this stuff comes off so easily. I really recommend just hand sanding this with 220 and then following up with 320. And like I said, you may have to do 1 or 2 coats, but inevitably what we're doing is we're prepping and priming this to do filler primer, which is going to fill in those even more minuscule areas, those PLA lines, those imperfections, those dips. So again, with glazing putty, I like hitting it with 220 and 320, get it nice and smooth, and then what we do is we start putting our filler primer on and we kind of repeat the process. So basically, once we get ready to add some filler primer, once our parts are sanded and glazed to our liking, we start applying the filler primer. I highly recommend Bondo filler primer. It has great buildup. It's lacquer based, so it dries super quick. You can sand it within 30 minutes after application, and it is an absolute lifesaver. You can see right here, these front parts, I have sanded them with 220 and 320. After 2 coats of filler primer, and then I basically cleaned them, and boom, look how much better these look now. So this is after 2 more coats, 2 light coats, of course. You don't want to put them on too heavy, but it just fills and makes everything look absolutely fantastic. As stated, it's lacquer based. Most of your Rust-Oleum and Krylon filler primers, they're water based, so they run, they need hours to dry. If you sand them too soon, it gums up your sandpaper. You don't have to worry about that with this. So you can see right here, this earpiece was sanded with 220 and then 320, and then I come in with the Bondo filler primer. Boom, look how clean, look how just uniform, and everything looks super great. It's such a vital part in getting pieces clean. Obviously, your initial sanding and prep is great, but this stuff does build up and it does fill in everything great. A very important thing, though, is you don't want to keep using the same sandpaper, okay? So last thing you'd want to do is apply this, Bondo filler primer and go at it with 180 or 220. You want to work up. So typically what I'll do is I'll do 2 coats. I'll do 220, 320, 2 more coats, and then do 320, 400. Basically work your way up. You don't want to take all of the filler primer off. You want it to fill in those imperfections. But when you do this method of gradually increasing your sandpaper grit, you're going to get nice, smooth pieces like this. It does take time. It does take patience. Again, I do this all by hand. I don't use a machine. But overall, in the end, your pieces look absolutely fantastic, nice and smooth and uniform, and you're going to get them ready for their final coat of of primer. And speaking of final priming, that's the last step. So before all of my prints are done before paint, I either use a primer sealer or a self-etching primer. Now a primer sealer, what that's going to do is completely seal off the primer and it won't allow it to bleed through to the paint. So if you have a darker colored primer and you're painting it like white or yellow, that primer is not going to bleed through and affect the color. A self-etching primer is going to give you maximum adhesion. So it's going to bond the best and just really fuse the primer and the paint together. So especially if you're doing multiple coats, that is absolutely great. You can see these pieces here off to the right, they have the self-etching primer. The ones in the back, they still have the Bondo, but I always like to do this because it allows the paint to basically grab and bond the best. I do a lot of coats, so I want that maximum adhesion, and it really does lay great, and it gives me great results. All right, so hopefully a lot of helpful information for you there with those pictures. Like I said, this video is kind of a precursor to a video that I'm going to show step-by-step video, really dig in deep and kind of show you guys how I get my prints nice and smooth. But that was just a little bit of info of kind of what products I use, what method, but there will be a lot more in the next video coming up. But basically, once everything's sanded, you can kind of get into painting. Now, I did use automotive PPG paints. So these are the same paints that you would basically use on a car. So my setup is a little bit different. Now in the next video, when I do my wet sanding video, I am just going to be using standard rattle can and some 2X clear that you can get at like a local Walmart or AutoZone or wherever you might get your paint from, Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever tickles your fancy. You can get all those paints there. So I'm going to be using more of a consumer grade paint, I guess you could say, what most people tend to use, you know, when they're doing projects like this. I just have experience in the automotive field in the background, so I already have all these things, so I just kind of paint them with these because I like to. But realistically, you know, paint jobs like this, these candy paints, these metallic paints, they're very hard, nearly impossible to replicate with a rattle can. You can get some good metallic paints that will still give you some good, awesome shine. But my painting scheme was a little bit different. But what I'm going to do is basically kind of break down essentially what I did to paint them, different tips and tricks on placement and things like that. So why don't you go ahead and watch a couple of these slides and I'll kind of explain my whole breakdown on how I got everything painted. All right, so some painting tips and tricks. First thing is you want to wait about 24 to 30 hours after your pieces are primered, dried, and fully cured before you start laying the paint. When you do start laying the paint, one, you want to do very, very light coats, and you want to make sure you're in a dust-free environment, and you want to make sure your humidity's low. If you're in a dusty place, if you have a lot of humidity, it's really going to affect the way your paint turns out. Make a paint booth if you want, or put it in a box, or do whatever. I know a lot of people spray these pieces in their basement, in their sheds, places like that. Make sure you have a somewhat dry environment because humidity will create a slow curing process for your paints. So basically here, this is after I had painted it and laid the first coat of clear, but you can kind of see how there's some distortion. The light's clear, but it's not as clear as it could be. So all of my pieces, I basically wet sand. Now, I'm not going to get too crazy into wet sanding, but what wet sanding does is it helps get rid of that orange peel. Orange peel causes refraction. You want light to reflect, not to refract. So when paint dries and cures, it shrinks. So when it shrinks, it creates orange peel. So this is a piece that I had wet sanded, and you can see after I wet sanded it, and then basically just buffed and polished it, how much cleaner and crisper that light is. There's very minimal distortion. Of course, I went back and touched it up, but you can see how much cleaner that piece looks versus the other piece. So if you are looking for that clean, crisp, vibrant finish, wet sanding is the way to go. All of these pieces that you're seeing here were all wet sanded by hand. I do not use any sort of DA machine or anything like that. When I got into laying the red, it was a candy paint. So basically all of the pigmentation and the sparkle and the shine is actually in the tinted clear coat. So when I laid these down originally, this is how candy paint looks. It doesn't look that shiny with just the base coat. It looks very flat. It looks very almost distorted and unorganized. But once you start laying the clear coat on, it really comes to life. Now, I did do a tinted clear, and then I also did just a straight clear coat on top of it. You don't want to wet sand any sort of tinted clear because you'll take the color right off. And obviously, we don't want to do that. But again, these are just all the pieces here that are just have the candy color on there. And then the next picture here, you'll see once we start getting the tinted clear on, boom, look how much different that looks. So this was laid, you know, actually pretty smooth. It laid a lot better, so I didn't really have to wet sand the red quite as much. I did go back and wet sand it, but this was that you can still see that top where the window is. There still is orange peel, so I did actually go through and wet sand all of these after the final layer of clear is done. But of course, I'm giving myself adequate time in between layering. So here is it after the final layer of clear, but you can see the distortion in that dome piece. Those just aren't up to my standard. So basically what I did is I went through and wet sanded the whole piece. And again, I do have videos out with how to wet sand, and I'll have a newer one out that dives in a little bit more. And then this is after buffing and polishing. So you can see how much cleaner and crisper those lights look. So this is what wet sanding is going to give you. You know, if you hear people talk about wet sanding and you're like, what is it? What does it do? These are some visuals here. Look how much cleaner and crisper that window looks. It's not as distorted. It's not as wavy. That light, that shine, the glare, the reflection, amazing. This is after the final wet sanding because, of course, I went back and did it multiple times to try to get rid of as much of the orange peel and distortion as possible. But you can just see, I mean, it's like a mirror. It just absolutely reflects off. The candy paint just brought a whole new level of vibrance to this. This was the first time that I did candy metallic helmet, and it really came out awesome. It was definitely a lot of work, but in the end, it really came out great. So wet sanding will definitely help you get that mirror-esque finish. You don't necessarily have to use candy paints, but these were just all visuals on, you know, what it actually does, you know, for you. This back head piece here coming up, this is another piece here that was wet sanded and buffed and polished, and you can just see, I mean, it just looks great. It just looks super clear, super shiny. I couldn't go as hard in some areas because there's, you know, how that the back piece kind of overlaps. You don't want to burn through the paint. It is very hard on some of these helmets. It's not like doing it on a car or a big flat surface. So there were some areas that weren't as clean as I'd like them. But again, I'm being honest in my pieces. I'm letting you know, hey, if you run into this, this is what can happen. The idea is just to generally get it looking as clean as you possibly can. And I think overall, I definitely nailed it with this piece. You'll see on this jaw piece here, this is a piece that was not wet sanded, that was just clear coated, and you can see all the distortion. It's just not very clean, not very crisp. This piece, I did not go through and buff and polish. Inevitably, I just wet sanded it and ended up re-clear coating it, but it really ended up turning out pretty awesome. The faceplate, that was pretty easy. I was able to wet sand that and buff and polish it because it was completely flat. So here you can see it before. You can see the distortion right here. That light just doesn't look as clean and as crisp as it could be. So basically what I did is I went through and wet sanded it with 1500, 2000, 3000, and 5000. So you can see it's very dull there and it doesn't look very shiny. That's because it was all sanded up. But after I went through and gave it a nice buff and polish, boom, look how much more crisper, cleaner, and vibrant it looks. So again, another visual that's basically showing you actually what wet sanding does. And realistically, wet sanding should only be used in your finishing process. You do not need to wet sand PLA. You should never wet sand primer. You should really only be wet sanding clear coat to get rid of distortion. Here, that final dome piece put all together after it's all wet sanded looks absolutely wild. Was really super happy with the way this turned out, and I did go back a couple times and wet sand this. This isn't done in just one step, but overall it just looked absolutely amazing. I couldn't be happier with it. You can see there, if you zoom in a little bit, just how clean and crisp that light reflection is. The flake is just absolutely jumping off the helmet, in my opinion. So really overall it did turn out awesome. Very glossy, very shiny. So if you are wanting your pieces to look like this, I will have a more in-depth video on how to properly wet sand. I do have one video up, but the new one's going to definitely explain a lot more, a little bit more in depth. This piece absolutely sucked. I'm definitely going to do things different when I do this. I mentioned earlier in the video, I'll do that cheek piece separate. This was kind of a nightmare trying to sand this and tape this off and get it all painted and masked off and everything. You know, overall in the end, I did prevail. It's probably really the only weak point in the whole helmet, to be honest with you. It looks good, but it doesn't look great. You'll see it here. I put blue pinstriping around it just to kind of hide some of the overspray within it. You know, at this point, it's such a fine, meticulous, detailed piece. It's, you don't want to go too OCD and end up having to backtrack and do things over. So I did as best I could, but in the future, it'll be done even better. After everything was dried and I let it sit for a couple days, it was time to start putting this thing together and getting the LED eyes installed. All right, well, hopefully those tips were of some help to you. I know it's hard without video. Like I said, we're going to have a lot more coming in the future, but I don't want to dive in too deep into of exactly how I mixed the paint or sprayed the paint or anything, because not everybody has an HVLP setup. Not everyone is using PPG paints, but that was just a general breakdown of how I painted it. More or less, I wanted to talk about the wet sanding and the polishing and things like that. Really, to get this mirror-esque shine, you really do have to go ahead and wet sand and kind of smooth all that out. Get rid of that orange peel, some of those defects that will naturally come. It doesn't matter if you use aerosol. It doesn't matter if you use an HVLP gun, what type of paint. Essentially, all paints will shrink and create things like orange peel. And orange peel causes distortion, and that's when you get distortion, that's kind of what makes them not look as crisp as this. When you wet sand, when you smooth that finish out, that's when you really get these nice, clean, crisp, deep looking finishes, very similar to this. So hopefully you found those tips helpful, but like I said, we will have a lot more. I'm just kind of getting the ball rolling, getting you guys excited for what's to come. So hopefully you can use those tips until the next video comes out. If you have a question on anything, you can leave me a comment, and of course I will respond back as soon as possible. But wet sanding will definitely help you achieve a look similar to this, so I always recommend it. Lastly on this is basically the LED eyes, and I've done several videos where I show LED eyes. It's pretty simple. You basically get yourself a pair of LED eyes. They have them on eBay. There's ones on Alibaba that are flexible. There's a link in the description to the ones that I use. You can use a heat gun, you can use the oven like I do. Basically what you want to do is you want to cut that frosted cover off, and I'll show you why you want to cut it off. So this was one of my first 3D prints. I didn't paint it. It's about 1.5 years old. And I used LED eyes, but you can see that I didn't remove that frosted cover and I didn't heat them up. And hopefully you can kind of see there's kind of like a big gap. See how that just doesn't really look all that good. These weren't heated, these weren't bent. I did not remove the frosted layer. So that's why I recommend removing them, because your eyes look like this. They're way more symmetrical, way more uniform, and they just fit a lot better, and you can kind of see that grit in there. What's cool is when you take that frosted cover off, when these are off, you can see through them. With these, you can't. So there's a big difference there. Hopefully you can tell. You can see that grid pattern. You absolutely can't really see much on there because it's frosted over. But on both of these, again, this was my first one, so it's pretty sloppy. They're just glued in place. There's all kinds of duct tape and stuff in there to try to hold the lines. With this one, I don't want to get fingerprints on it here because I'm really OCD about that, but hopefully you can kind of see a little bit cleaner. We got some foam padding in there. There's obviously still some hot glue, but looks a lot more cleaner. So again, if you're starting off with 3D printing, guys, you know, you will get better with time. Practice makes perfect. So don't get discouraged. Hopefully videos like these help you. You know, everybody started somewhere, you know what I mean? So just practice, do your research, and you will get better with time. And the only way to get better is to fail, you know what I mean? Obviously this isn't exactly a showroom piece, and believe it or not, there's even things on here that I could improve. But again, it's an awesome community, and we're all here to help each other, and hopefully these videos are absolutely helping you. So after you've got your eyes and everything installed, guys, I mean, it's pretty much good to go. Hopefully your helmet is looking something similar to this. Now, I will say I did do, you know, the eyes on just the faceplate itself. I definitely recommend doing that. Of course, if you're doing a different build, or something like that. I guess it just depends on what stage you're at. But always try to make it easier for yourself. It would be a lot harder to flip this upside down and do the eyes. Just do it with the faceplate separate. Realistically, any Iron Man faceplate that you are doing, just do it with just the faceplate. This is not a functioning faceplate. This is essentially going to be a display piece that occasionally will be worn. So there is foam in it for extra support. It's, you know, reinforced a lot with super glue, or we should say with hot glue, not super glue, with hot glue. Like I said, this is a tricky piece. There's a lot of gaps and things in here, but this is just how this helmet is supposed to be made. Don't be afraid to use hot glue. There's nothing wrong with it. Could I have gone through and done PLA welding? Absolutely. The thing is, if I would have done it with this, I would have scratched the heck out of the paint. So my recommendation is, if you're merging things together, you know, if you're doing PLA welding, I would probably say painting for the very last step, or make sure you have a ton of clear coat on, because you're going to have to wet sand that and rebuff it and repolish it, just positioning it and moving it around. PLA welding is really something that should be done in your processing, not in your finishing part. So that's why I always stick with hot glue. I use the black industrial glue, hot glue. It works really great, really strong. This one here, you know, it's glued together and everything the same way that one is, and it's nice and sturdy, you know what I mean? So don't sleep on industrial hot glue, guys. It works great. It will hold your pieces together. But this is kind of just a before and after of, you know, when I started and where I'm at today. You know, obviously both pieces are pretty cool, but you'll get better. I guess that's the main focus of this video here. All right, guys, well, that's pretty much it for this video. Hopefully this video has given you some good insight and pointed you in the right direction of kind of where to start, whether you're new to 3D printing or you've been doing 3D printing and you're looking ways to just kind of step your game up and, you know, make your prints look a little bit better. Like I said, this is a little bit of a teaser. I'm going to have a video that is going to really dig into how to properly sand, smooth, prep, and process your 3D prints to go from this to this, you know. So it's really going to be some in-depth videos. I'm going to have some, you know, proper terminology. Really just, it's going to be a geeky video, guys, but I'm telling you, you're not going to want to miss it because it's really going to help you. But I've been doing things like this, and the limited amount of time that I have, I'm really able to knock helmets out a lot quicker. I was able to do this helmet in about 3.5 weeks in my off time. This helmet in general took me about 18 to 20 hours to completely make from start to finish. So, you know, realistically, if you got 2 full days off in a row, you can knock a helmet out in 2 days beginning to end. So definitely look out for those videos because they'll help you. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching this video. If you are a subscriber, thank you so much. I do appreciate you guys coming back and watching videos and commenting and liking them and giving me insight. I listened to a couple of you. I hope you like that new intro video. It's nice and short. It's not super long. So I did that for each and one of you that were sitting there saying, my God, this intro video is too long. Well, now it's only 19 seconds. But now I'm going to leave you with a minute outro video. I'm just joking. I'm not. But thanks again, guys. Like I said, that's it for this video. Be on the lookout for those 2 videos, the prep video and then the painting and wet sanding videos. I am working on them right now. And of course, we'll have more suits or more updates on the War Machine suit as it comes along. I've also got a new Darth Vader helmet that I will be working on. So I will show you guys that. That will be with black. So that's going to be a great wet sanding video as well. But that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Leave me a comment in the comment section. Again, if you're not subscribed, click that subscribe button. Click the notification bell to be notified when those new videos comes up. If you like this video, give me one of these. Leave me a comment, and we'll see you next time, guys. Later.